The lawyer's pen scratched across the paper with a finality that made my hands shake. 17 years old, sitting in this sterile office in downtown Portland, and I was about to inherit 300 acres of Oregon farmland from a man I'd never met. Ronald Miller, the lawyer said, looking at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. Your grandfather. The words hit me like a physical blow because I'd spent my entire life believing I had no family at all. The letter in my trembling fingers was dated just 2 weeks ago, written in shaky handwriting that spoke of urgency and approaching death. To my granddaughter, Sarah Cook, it began, and I had to read those words 3 times before they made sense. I know you don't know me, and I have no right to ask anything of you after all these years of silence. But I'm dying, and this land needs someone who understands what it means to fight for a place to belong. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on a journey that changed everything I thought I knew about family and home. I stared at the inheritance papers spread across Ronald Miller's mahogany desk, my mind reeling back to how I'd gotten here. Just 3 days earlier, I'd been packing my few belongings into a cardboard box at Riverside Children's Home, the same gray institutional building that had housed me for the past 6 years. At 17, I was aging out of the system with nowhere to go except a tiny studio apartment downtown and a part-time job at a coffee shop that barely covered rent. Sister Margaret had called me into her office that Tuesday morning with an expression that I'd never seen before. In all my years at Riverside, she'd maintained the same professional distance with every kid who came and went, but that morning she looked almost hopeful. Sarah, she'd said, holding an official-looking envelope with trembling hands. This came for you yesterday. It's from a law firm. My first thought was that I was in trouble somehow. Kids like me didn't get mail from lawyers unless something had gone wrong. But as I tore open the envelope and read the letter inside, my entire world shifted on its axis. Jeffrey Bennett, the lawyer who'd written the initial letter, explained that my grandfather had hired a private investigator to find me. Apparently, he'd been looking for 3 years, ever since his son, my father, had died in a car accident. The same father I'd been told had abandoned me as a baby. The same father whose name I'd never even known. Your father was Eric Rivera, the letter explained. He changed his name when he left home at 18 after a falling out with his father. He never told anyone about you, not even us. We only learned of your existence when we found his personal effects after the accident. I remembered sitting in Sister Margaret's office, reading those words over and over, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. Eric Rivera. My father had a name and he hadn't abandoned me at all. He died when I was 12, never knowing that his father was desperately searching for the granddaughter he'd never met. The rest of the letter was a blur of legal terms and property descriptions, but the core message was clear. My grandfather, Raymond Cox, had spent his final months trying to make amends for a family feud that had cost him his son and, unknowingly, his granddaughter. The 300 acres of farmland outside the small town of Millfield was his way of saying sorry, his attempt to give me the roots he'd failed to provide when I needed them most. Now, sitting in the lawyer's office with Ronald Miller explaining the inheritance process, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The farm came with everything: the house, the barn, the equipment, even a small savings account that Raymond Cox had been building for years in case he ever found me. There's one condition, Ronald Miller said, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the legal documents. You have to live on the property for at least 1 full year before you can sell it. Your grandfather wanted to ensure that whoever inherited his life's work would give it a fair chance. A year, 12 months in a place I'd never seen, in a town where I knew absolutely nobody, trying to figure out how to run a farm when I'd never even grown a houseplant successfully. The smart thing would have been to politely decline, to stick with my original plan of aging out quietly and building a simple life in the city. But as I looked at the faded photograph Ronald Miller had given me, showing a weathered man standing in front of a red barn with rolling green fields stretching behind him, something deep in my chest ached with longing. This stranger in the photo was my grandfather. His eyes, even in the old picture, looked exactly like mine. The drive to Millfield took 4 hours through winding mountain roads that gradually gave way to vast expanses of farmland. I'd borrowed an old Honda Civic from Sister Margaret, promising to return it once I figured out transportation. My entire life fit in the back seat. 3 boxes of clothes, a handful of books, and the manila envelope containing all the legal documents that proved I now owned something real and substantial. As I drove, I kept thinking about the conversation I'd had with Kelly Carter, my caseworker, the night before I left Portland. She'd been handling my transition out of the system, helping me navigate the paperwork for my apartment and job when I told her about the inheritance. "Sarah," she'd said, leaning forward in her chair with concern written across her face. "This sounds too good to be true. Are you absolutely certain this is legitimate? There are scams that target kids aging out of foster care." I'd shown her all the documentation, the verified letters from multiple law firms, even the death certificate for Raymond Cox. But Kelly's skepticism reflected my own fears. How could someone like me, who'd never had anything, suddenly inherit a fortune in land and property? "Even if it's real," Kelly had continued, "do you have any idea how much work it takes to run a farm? The physical demands, the financial responsibility, the isolation? You've lived in the city your entire life." She was right, of course. I knew nothing about farming, about rural life, about managing property, or dealing with the dozens of practical challenges that came with owning land. But something in Raymond Cox's letter had touched a part of me I'd kept buried for years, the part that dreamed of having a place where I truly belonged. The GPS announced that I was 5 miles from Millfield as the landscape around me shifted into rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and red barns. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, making the fields look like something from a painting. I'd never seen so much open space, so much sky stretching endlessly in every direction. Millfield itself was smaller than I'd imagined, just a single main street lined with brick buildings that looked like they hadn't changed much since the 1950s. There was a diner called Dorothy's Place, a feed store, a small grocery market, and what appeared to be the town's only gas station. A few people walked along the sidewalks, moving with the unhurried pace of small-town life. I stopped at the gas station to ask for directions to the Cox property, and the elderly man behind the counter looked at me with undisguised curiosity. "You must be Raymond's granddaughter," he said before I could even introduce myself. "Word travels fast around here. I'm Justin Green, been running this place for 30 years. Knew your grandfather well, good man, stubborn as a mule, but good-hearted." The casual way he claimed knowledge of my existence unsettled me. In the city, anonymity was easy. Here, apparently, my arrival was already common knowledge. "The farm's about 3 miles north and on County Road 15, Justin continued, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Can't miss it. Big red barn right at the front of the property. Raymond kept the place in good shape right up until the end." I thanked him and bought a bottle of water, aware that his eyes followed me as I walked back to the car. Small towns, I was learning, had their own rhythms and rules. County Road 15 was a narrow 2-lane road that wound through pastures and cornfields. I drove slowly, taking in the landscape that was apparently now mine to care for. The responsibility felt crushing and exhilarating at the same time. Then I saw it. The red barn Justin had mentioned rose from a gentle hill, like something from a postcard, its weathered wood glowing in the afternoon light. Behind it stretched a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and green shutters, surrounded by mature oak trees that provided natural shade. Fields extended in every direction, some planted with crops I couldn't identify, others lying fallow and ready for spring planting. I pulled into the gravel driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, engine off, just staring at what was now my home. The silence was profound after years of institutional noise, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the oak leaves. The house key was exactly where Ronald Miller had said it would be, under a ceramic frog beside the front steps. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was clean, but clearly hadn't been lived in for several weeks. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through lace curtains. The furniture was simple but well made, a worn leather couch, a wooden dining table with 6 chairs, built-in bookcases filled with farming manuals and classic novels. On the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace sat a collection of framed photographs. I approached them slowly, my heart hammering. There was Raymond Cox at various ages, sometimes alone, sometimes with a woman I assumed was my grandmother. And there, in a place of honor in the center, was a picture of a young man who looked startlingly like me. My father, Eric Rivera, before he changed his name and left home. Beside that photo was an envelope with my name written in the same shaky handwriting as the letter I'd received. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. "Sarah," the note read, "if you're reading this, then you've decided to give this old place a chance. The key opens the desk in my bedroom upstairs. Everything you need to know about running the farm is in there, along with some things I should have told your father years ago. I hope you can forgive an old man's pride and stubbornness. This land has been in our family for 4 generations. You're the fifth, and I pray you'll find the peace here that I failed to give your father. Welcome home, granddaughter." I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The master bedroom was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a large window overlooking the back fields. The desk Raymond had mentioned sat in the corner, an old roll-top piece that looked like it had been in the family for decades. The brass key turned easily in the lock, and the desk opened to reveal neat stacks of papers, ledgers, and manila folders organized with military precision. On top of everything was another envelope marked "Read this first." Inside was a detailed letter explaining the farm's operations, the names and phone numbers of neighboring farmers who could help, and a complete financial breakdown of assets, debts, and expected seasonal income. Raymond Cox had left nothing to chance. He'd even included a monthly calendar showing when different crops needed to be planted, tended, and harvested. But it was the personal items mixed in with the business documents that made my throat tight with emotion. There were newspaper clippings about my high school academic achievements, somehow obtained by the private investigator he'd hired. Report cards, honor roll certificates, even a photo from the school newspaper when I'd won a writing contest. He'd been collecting pieces of my life, trying to know the granddaughter he'd never met. At the bottom of the desk was a wooden box containing letters my father had written home during his first year away. I read them by lamplight as darkness fell outside, learning about the young man who'd given me life but died before I could know him. "Dad," one letter began, "I know you think I'm making a mistake leaving the farm, but I need to find my own way. The land is beautiful, and I know you've put your heart into every acre, but it feels like a cage to me. Maybe someday I'll understand what you see in it, but right now I need to discover who I am beyond these fields." The letters grew less frequent and more distant over time, documenting a growing rift between father and son that apparently never healed. The last letter was dated just 6 months before I was born, a brief note mentioning that Eric had met someone special, but providing no details about my mother or the pregnancy. I spent that first night in my grandfather's house reading through years of family history I'd never known existed. By dawn, I had a clearer picture of the man who'd left me this inheritance and the son who'd died never knowing he had a daughter. The next few days were a crash course in rural living. Barbara Harris, who lived on the neighboring farm, appeared at my door the morning after my arrival carrying a casserole and wearing an expression of frank curiosity. "I'm Barbara," she announced, pushing past me into the kitchen without invitation. "Raymond asked me to keep an eye on the place after he passed, and I've been watching for you to show up. You look just like your father did at your age. Same stubborn chin." Barbara, I quickly learned, was a force of nature disguised as a 60-something farm wife. She'd known Raymond for 30 years and had strong opinions about everything from proper fence maintenance to the best time to plant corn. She also seemed determined to take me under her wing whether I wanted her help or not. "First thing you need to understand," she said, unpacking groceries she'd apparently bought for me, "is that farming isn't something you learn from books. Raymond left you good instructions, but this land will teach you what you really need to know if you pay attention to it." She was right about the learning curve being steep. My first week was a series of small disasters and minor victories. I managed to figure out how to start the ancient tractor, but nearly drove it through the barn wall. I successfully fed the dozen chickens Raymond had left behind, but forgot to collect the eggs for 3 days running. The physical demands were unlike anything I'd experienced. My hands, soft from years of indoor living, developed blisters within days. My back ached constantly from bending and lifting. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, a sense of purpose I'd never felt stocking shelves or taking coffee orders. Diane Carter, Barbara's daughter who worked as a veterinarian in town, stopped by at the end of my first week to check on the livestock. She was about my age, with sun-streaked hair, and the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up knowing exactly where you belonged. "So you're the mysterious granddaughter," she said, examining one of the older cows with practiced efficiency. "The whole town's been talking about you. Raymond spent years looking for family, and then suddenly here you are." I helped her move the cattle into the barn for examination, grateful for her straightforward manner. Unlike some of the other townspeople I'd encountered, Diane didn't seem to view me as either a curiosity or a potential threat to the established order. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked as we finished up. "Or is this just a temporary thing until you can sell the place?" It was the question everyone seemed to be asking, directly or indirectly. I could see it in the way people looked at me at the grocery store, in the careful politeness of my interactions with other farmers. They were waiting to see if I was serious about this new life or just another city person playing at rural living. "I honestly don't know yet," I told Diane. "A month ago, I didn't even know this place existed. Now I'm supposed to figure out if I can build a life here." She nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. But I'll tell you this, your grandfather spent 40 years building something special here. It would be a shame to see it broken up and sold to developers." That night, I sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the fields that belonged to me, thinking about Diane's words. The developers had already started calling, somehow having gotten word of the inheritance. They offered sums that seemed impossible for someone who'd never owned anything more valuable than a used laptop. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds of the countryside, I began to understand what my grandfather had been trying to tell me in his letters. This wasn't just land or property or a financial asset. It was a legacy, a connection to something larger than myself. The real test came 3 weeks after my arrival, when I discovered that Raymond Cox's death had created complications I hadn't anticipated. I was in town picking up supplies when Dorothy Miller, the woman who owned the local diner, mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Shame about Eric Rivera trying to contest the will," she said casually as she rang up my order. "Though I suppose it makes sense, him being Raymond's nephew and all." I stared at her in confusion. "Eric Rivera is dead. He was my father." Dorothy's face went pale. "Oh, honey, no. Eric Rivera is very much alive. He's Raymond's brother's boy, lives up in Seattle. Been making noise about the inheritance since word got out that Raymond left everything to some granddaughter nobody had ever heard of." The world seemed to tilt sideways. There was another Eric Rivera, a cousin I'd never known existed, and he was challenging my right to inherit the farm. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The phone was ringing when I walked into the house. Ronald Miller, the lawyer, sounded tired when I answered. "Sarah, I'm glad you called back. We have a situation we need to discuss. Eric Rivera has filed a formal challenge to the will, claiming that Raymond Cox was not of sound mind when he made the bequest, and that the inheritance should go to blood relatives who actually knew the deceased." I sank into Raymond's old leather chair, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath me again. "What does this mean? Can he take the farm away?" "It's complicated," Ronald admitted. "The challenge has merit from a legal standpoint. You never met Raymond, never had any contact with him. Eric Rivera, on the other hand, has been in regular communication with his uncle for years. He can demonstrate an ongoing relationship and knowledge of the property." The next few days were a blur of legal consultations and document reviews. I learned that Eric Rivera was a successful real estate developer who specialized in converting agricultural land into residential subdivisions. His interest in the farm had nothing to do with preserving Raymond's legacy and everything to do with the property's potential value as housing development. Barbara Harris was furious when she heard about the legal challenge. She stormed into my kitchen one morning, carrying a plate of muffins and wearing an expression that could have curdled milk. "That boy," she said, slamming the plate down on the counter, "has been circling this property like a vulture for years. Every time Raymond got sick, Eric would show up with papers to sign and talk about the family's financial future. Raymond saw right through him." She sat down across from me at the kitchen table. her anger giving way to something that looked like fear. "Sarah, you have to fight this. If Eric gets his hands on this land, he'll have it subdivided and sold within 6 months. 40 years of careful stewardship gone." I wanted to fight, but the legal fees alone were staggering. Ronald Miller had explained that contesting a will challenge could cost tens of thousands of dollars. Money I didn't have. The farm was profitable, but barely, and most of the assets were tied up in land and equipment. That's when Justin Green, the gas station owner, surprised me with an offer I hadn't expected. I'd stopped by to fill up the truck when he waved me over to his office, a cramped space behind the service bay filled with automotive manuals and coffee-stained invoices. "Heard about your legal troubles," he said without preamble. "Also heard you might need some financial backing to fight that weasel from Seattle." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. "Here's the thing," Justin continued. "This town has been watching developers circle our farmland for years, waiting for the old-timers to die off so they can swoop in and turn everything into strip malls and housing developments. Raymond's place is prime real estate, and if Eric Rivera gets his hands on it, it'll be the beginning of the end for Millfield as we know it." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "So some of us have been talking, and we want to make you a proposition. We'll front the money for your legal fees, help you fight this challenge, in exchange for a conservation easement on the property that prevents future development." The conservation easement, Justin explained, would legally protect the farm from being subdivided or developed while still allowing me to live on it, work it, and eventually pass it on to my own heirs. It was exactly the kind of protection Raymond would have wanted. "Why would you do this for me?" I asked. "You barely know me." Justin smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "Because Raymond Cox was a good man who loved this land, and because you're the only thing standing between Millfield and a future full of strip malls and traffic lights. Sometimes you have to invest in the future you want to see." The legal battle took 3 months to resolve. Eric Rivera hired expensive lawyers from Seattle who painted me as an opportunistic stranger taking advantage of an elderly man's loneliness. They questioned my motives, my qualifications, even my right to call myself Raymond's granddaughter. But Ronald Miller and the team of attorneys the town had helped me hire fought back with evidence of Raymond's careful planning and clear intent. They presented the private investigators' reports, showing the extensive search for me, the detailed instructions Raymond had left for my transition to farm life, and testimony from neighbors who confirmed that he'd spoken frequently about his hope of finding his lost granddaughter. The turning point came when Barbara Harris took the stand and told the court about a conversation she'd had with Raymond just weeks before his death. "He said he'd made mistakes with his son, let pride get in the way of love," she testified. "He said finding Sarah was his chance to do right by the next generation, to make sure the land went to someone who would care for it the way it deserved." The judge's decision came on a cold February morning. I sat in the courthouse between Ronald Miller and Barbara Harris, my hands clenched in my lap as Judge Patricia Williams read her ruling. "While the court recognizes that Mr. Eric Rivera has a legitimate claim as a blood relative who maintained contact with the deceased," she began, and my heart sank. "The evidence clearly shows that Raymond Cox was of sound mind when he executed his will, and that his decision to leave the property to his granddaughter was made after careful consideration and extensive legal consultation." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I nearly fainted. The farm was mine, legally and permanently. Eric Rivera could appeal, but Ronald Miller assured me that the judge's ruling was comprehensive enough to withstand further challenge. Outside the courthouse, Eric Rivera approached me with an expression of barely controlled anger. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed expensive suits and corporate success. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you're doing. That farm will bankrupt you within 2 years, and when it does, I'll be waiting to buy it from the bank." I looked at this stranger who shared my father's name and felt nothing but pity. "My grandfather didn't leave me this land because he thought I could run it perfectly from day one," I told him. "He left it to me because he believed I would learn to love it the way he did. That's something you can't buy or develop or subdivide." Eric Rivera walked away without another word, and I never saw him again. The victory celebration at Dorothy's Diner that night was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 17 years of life. It seemed like half the town had shown up to congratulate me and welcome me officially into the community. Farmers who'd been politely distant suddenly treated me like family. The bank president shook my hand and offered to discuss agricultural loans. Even the Methodist minister invited me to join the church, though I politely declined. But the real celebration happened later that night when I sat alone on my front porch, looking out over fields that were undeniably, legally, permanently mine. The stars were brighter than anything I'd ever seen in the city, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Spring brought new challenges and new understanding. With Barbara Harris as my unofficial mentor and Diane Carter providing veterinary expertise, I began to grasp the intricate rhythms of agricultural life. Every day brought lessons about soil composition, weather patterns, crop rotation, and the dozens of other factors that determine whether a farm succeeded or failed. The physical work grew easier as my body adapted. My hands developed calluses, my back grew stronger, and I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when plants needed water, when animals were sick, or when equipment required maintenance. More importantly, I began to understand what Raymond had meant about the land teaching you what you needed to know. There were setbacks, of course. A late frost killed half my tomato seedlings. The old tractor broke down during hay season, requiring expensive repairs. A summer storm damaged part of the barn roof. But each crisis taught me something new about resilience, about community support, about the satisfaction that came from solving problems with your own hands and ingenuity. The financial picture gradually improved as I learned to maximize the farm's income streams. In addition to the traditional crops Raymond had planted, I started a small organic vegetable operation that supplied Dorothy's Diner and the local grocery store. Barbara Harris taught me how to preserve and can surplus produce, creating value-added products that sold well at the farmer's market in the county seat. By my first autumn on the farm, I was no longer the confused city girl who'd arrived with everything she owned in 3 cardboard boxes. I was becoming something I'd never imagined possible. A farmer, a landowner, a permanent resident of Millfield with roots that grew deeper every day. The anniversary of my arrival fell on a crisp October day when the oak trees around the house blazed with red and gold leaves. I spent the morning walking the property boundaries, something I'd started doing regularly as a way of connecting with the land and planning for the future. Standing in the back pasture where Raymond had once grazed cattle, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I'd been a foster kid with no family, no prospects, and no sense of where I belonged in the world. Now I was a landowner with deep ties to a community, a growing understanding of agricultural life, and a clear vision for my future. That evening, I found myself back at Raymond's desk, writing in the journal I'd started keeping to document my first year on the farm. The entries chronicled everything from successful harvests to equipment failures, from community celebrations to moments of profound loneliness when the isolation of rural life felt overwhelming. But as I read through the months of entries, what struck me most was the gradual transformation in my voice. The early entries were full of uncertainty, fear, and homesickness for the institutional life I'd left behind. The recent entries reflected confidence, purpose, and a deep sense of belonging that I'd never experienced before. The second year brought new responsibilities and deeper integration into the community fabric of Millfield. Justin Green asked me to join the town council, arguing that the younger generation needed representation in local government. Barbara Harris nominated me for the County Agricultural Extension Board, where my combination of traditional farming knowledge and fresh perspective proved valuable in discussions about sustainable practices and land conservation. More personally, my relationship with Diane Carter evolved from professional consultation to genuine friendship. We spent long evenings on my front porch discussing everything from veterinary medicine to local politics to our shared experiences as young women trying to build careers in a traditionally male-dominated agricultural community. "You know what I admire about you?" Diane said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the fields gold and crimson. "You didn't just inherit this place, you earned it. Every blister, every early morning, every crisis you've handled has made you more of a farmer than some people who were born to it." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. The imposter syndrome that had plagued my first months on the farm had gradually faded as I proved to myself and the community that I belonged here not because of bloodlines or inheritance documents, but because of the work I was willing to do and the commitment I was prepared to make. The farm itself continued to evolve under my management. I expanded the organic vegetable operation, added a small flock of sheep for wool production, and began experimenting with heritage seed varieties that commanded premium prices at specialty markets. The financial picture improved steadily, allowing me to upgrade equipment, improve the house and barn, and build a modest emergency fund. But the most significant change was internal. The angry, defensive teenager who'd aged out of foster care had been replaced by a young woman with confidence, purpose, and deep roots in a community that had embraced her as family. I no longer woke up wondering where I belonged or whether I had value beyond my ability to perform assigned tasks. The third year brought unexpected challenges when a severe drought threatened crops throughout the region. Many smaller farms struggled to survive, and several longtime neighbors were forced to sell to developers or corporate agricultural operations. The conservation easement I'd signed protected my land from development, but it couldn't protect it from the economic pressures that were transforming rural communities across the country. Working with other local farmers, I helped organize a cooperative marketing effort that allowed smaller operations to compete with larger agribusiness by pooling resources and sharing distribution costs. The initiative was successful enough to attract attention from the state agricultural department, which featured our cooperative in a publication about innovative rural economic development. The recognition felt good, but what mattered more was the knowledge that I was helping preserve the kind of farming community that had embraced me when I needed it most. Raymond's legacy wasn't just the land he'd left me, it was the understanding that individual success meant nothing if the broader community failed to thrive. By my fourth year on the farm, I'd become something I never could have imagined during my institutional childhood: a community leader. I served on the school board, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and mentored other young people who were interested in agricultural careers. The girl who'd spent 17 years believing she had no family now had an extended family that included half the county. The house itself had evolved to reflect my growing sense of permanence and belonging. I'd renovated the kitchen with modern appliances while preserving its farmhouse character. The living room now displayed photographs documenting my journey from uncertain teenager to confident farmer, alongside the family pictures Raymond had left behind. But the most meaningful addition was the small office I'd created in what had once been a spare bedroom. The walls were lined with agricultural journals, business records, and planning documents for future farm improvements. On the desk sat Raymond's original letters to me, now preserved in protective sleeves, alongside letters I'd begun writing to the next generation. Because I'd decided that when my time came, I wouldn't make the same mistake Raymond had made with my father. I would document not just the practical aspects of farm management, but the emotional journey of building a life rooted in land and community. I would make sure that whoever inherited this place understood not just how to run it, but why it mattered. The fifth anniversary of my arrival at the farm coincided with the annual Millfield Harvest Festival, an event I'd helped organize for the past 3 years. The festival had grown from a small community gathering to a regional celebration that attracted visitors from across the state, bringing valuable tourism revenue to local businesses. Standing on the main stage that October afternoon, looking out over hundreds of people enjoying food, music, and crafts produced by local artisans and farmers, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what community looked like when people worked together toward common goals. But the moment that really captured the transformation of my life came later that evening, after the crowds had gone home and the cleanup was finished. I was walking through the festival grounds with Barbara Harris, picking up stray pieces of litter, when she stopped and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Raymond would be so proud," she said quietly, "not just of what you've done with the farm, but of who you've become. He always said this land needed someone who understood what it meant to fight for a place to belong." Turns out he was right. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, exactly 6 years after I'd first learned of my inheritance. The return address was unfamiliar, but the law firm's letterhead immediately caught my attention. Inside was a brief note from an attorney in California, along with a sealed envelope marked, "To be delivered to Sarah Cook on the 6th anniversary of her inheritance." My hands trembled as I recognized Raymond's handwriting on the envelope. Somehow, he'd arranged for this final letter to reach me years after his death, a message from beyond the grave, time to arrive, when I'd had enough experience to understand its full meaning. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd read his first letter all those years ago and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages written in Raymond's careful script, along with a small brass key I didn't recognize. My dear granddaughter, and the letter began, if you're reading this, then you've survived your first 6 years as a farmer and a member of the Millfield community. More importantly, you've proven that my faith in you was justified. The private investigator I hired didn't just find you, Sarah. He learned about your character, your resilience, your capacity for growth. That's why I knew you were the right person to inherit not just my land, but my responsibility to this community. The letter went on to explain that Raymond had established a trust fund, separate from the farm inheritance, that would provide resources for agricultural education and community development in Millfield. The brass key opened a safety deposit box at the local bank containing documents establishing the Raymond Cox Foundation for Rural Excellence. I've watched too many farming communities die as young people left for cities and family farms were sold to developers, the letter continued. But I've also seen what happens when one person decides to stay and fight for the place they love. You've become that person for Millfield, Sarah. Now I'm asking you to help others do the same. The foundation had enough assets to fund college scholarships for local students studying agriculture, low-interest loans for beginning farmers, and grants for community improvement projects. But more than that, it represented Raymond's vision of rural communities that could adapt and thrive instead of simply surviving. Reading his final letter, I finally understood the full scope of what my grandfather had been trying to accomplish. The farm inheritance hadn't been just about giving me a home or making amends for past family conflicts. It had been about investing in the future of rural America, one community and one person at a time. That afternoon, I drove to the bank to examine the contents of the safety deposit box. The foundation documents were comprehensive and professionally prepared, clearly the result of years of planning. There were detailed instructions for grant procedures, scholarship criteria, and board governance. There was even a suggested list of community members who might serve as trustees. But what moved me most was a folder containing letters from other young people who'd grown up in foster care or difficult family situations. Raymond had apparently been corresponding with several organizations that worked with at-risk youth, exploring ways to connect young people with agricultural opportunities. Every child deserves roots, one of his notes read. Not every child will find them in farming, but some will. Those are the ones we need to reach. That evening, I called a meeting of community leaders to discuss the foundation and its potential impact on Millfield's future. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people volunteering to serve on the board, contribute additional resources, and help identify young people who might benefit from the programs. Justin Green, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, summed up the community's feelings perfectly. Raymond always said this town's future depended on whether we could convince the next generation that rural life was worth preserving. Looks like he found a way to make that happen. The first Raymond Cox Foundation scholarships were awarded the following spring to 3 local high school students planning to study agriculture, veterinary medicine, and rural community development. The recipients included Diane Carter's younger brother, a neighbor's daughter who wanted to start an organic farming operation, and a young man from a struggling family who dreamed of becoming a large animal veterinarian. Watching those young people accept their scholarships at the high school graduation ceremony, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from participating in something larger than yourself. This was what legacy really meant, not just preserving what came before, but creating opportunities for what comes next. The Foundation's first community development grant funded improvements to the town's main street, including new sidewalks, period-appropriate street lighting, and facade renovations that enhanced Millfield's appeal to tourists and potential new residents. The changes were subtle but significant, giving the town a sense of pride and optimism that had been missing for years. More grants followed, supporting everything from a new playground at the elementary school to equipment upgrades for the volunteer fire department. Each project strengthened the community's infrastructure and demonstrated that rural towns could invest in their own futures instead of simply managing decline. But the program I was most proud of was the Beginning Farmer Initiative, which provided low-interest loans and mentorship opportunities for young people who wanted to start agricultural operations. The first recipient was a young woman from Portland who'd grown up in circumstances similar to mine and dreamed of building a sustainable farming operation. Working with her during her first year reminded me of my own journey and reinforced my understanding of how transformative it could be when someone believed in your potential, even when you didn't believe in it yourself. By my 7th year on the farm, the transformation of both my personal life and the broader community was undeniable. Millfield had become a model for rural revitalization, attracting attention from state officials, academic researchers, and other communities facing similar challenges. The combination of agricultural innovation, community investment, and strategic support for young farmers was creating a sustainable economic base that didn't depend on outside corporate investment or unsustainable development. My own operation had evolved into a diversified agricultural business that included organic vegetables, heritage livestock, value-added products, and agritourism activities. The farm hosted educational tours, seasonal festivals, and workshops on sustainable farming practices. Revenue streams that hadn't existed when I inherited the property now provided a comfortable living and resources for continued investment in land improvement and community development. But the most meaningful change was personal. The angry, defensive teenager who'd arrived with everything she owned in cardboard boxes had become a confident young woman with deep roots in a community that valued her contributions. I no longer woke up wondering where I belonged or whether I had value beyond my ability to perform assigned tasks. The house reflected this transformation. What had once been Raymond's simple bachelor quarters was now a warm, welcoming home filled with photographs documenting community events, shelves lined with agricultural and business books, and comfortable furniture chosen for both function and beauty. The kitchen had become the informal community center where neighbors gathered to discuss everything from crop prices to local politics. Most evenings found me on the front porch, often with visitors, watching the sun set over fields that represented not just my livelihood, but my identity. These conversations ranged from practical farming advice to deeper discussions about rural life, community values, and the challenges facing small towns across America. Diane Carter had become my closest friend and informal business partner, with her veterinary practice and my farming operations supporting each other in ways that strengthened both enterprises. We talked about formalizing our collaboration, possibly expanding into agricultural consulting services or for other rural communities. You know what's funny? Diane said one evening as we planned a joint presentation for a regional sustainable agriculture conference. When you first arrived, half the town was betting you wouldn't last 6 months. Now you're the person everyone calls when they need something done. Her observation was accurate. Somehow I'd become the go-to person for community organizing, grant writing, and problem solving. When the county threatened to close the rural health clinic, I'd helped organize the campaign that saved it. When the school district needed advocates for increased agricultural education funding, I'd testified before the state legislature. When neighboring communities wanted to replicate Millfield's revitalization success, I'd helped develop replicable models and training programs. The responsibility felt natural rather than burdensome. This was what belonging really meant. Not just having a place where you were accepted, but having a role that mattered, contributions that were valued, and relationships that provided both support and accountability. The 8th year brought new challenges when a large agribusiness corporation began buying farmland throughout the region, offering prices that many struggling farmers couldn't refuse. The consolidation threatened to transform the area from a community of independent family farms into an industrial agricultural zone with all the environmental and social problems that accompanied such operations. Working with other community leaders, I helped organize a regional coalition dedicated to preserving family farming and preventing corporate consolidation. The effort required sophisticated legal strategies, political advocacy, and public education campaigns that stretched my skills and understanding of agricultural policy. The coalition's success in blocking several proposed corporate purchases and strengthening land use regulations demonstrated what was possible when rural communities organized effectively. More importantly, it established a model for resistance that other regions could adapt to their own circumstances. These larger advocacy efforts introduced me to state and national networks of people working on rural development issues. I began speaking at conferences, writing articles for agricultural publications, and serving on advisory committees that influence policy at multiple levels of government. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most was the knowledge that the work was making a difference in real communities facing real challenges. The foundation Raymond had established was now funding similar initiatives in 3 other states, with plans for expansion to additional regions. On quiet evenings when the day's work was done and the house was peaceful, I sometimes returned to the desk where I'd first learned about my inheritance. The roll top now contained not just Raymond's original papers, but years of my own records documenting the farm's evolution and the community's transformation. I'd begun writing what I thought of as letters to the future, detailed accounts of lessons learned, mistakes made, and strategies that had proven effective. Like Raymond, I wanted to ensure that whoever came after me would have the benefit of accumulated wisdom and institutional memory. But unlike Raymond, I wasn't waiting until death to share what I'd learned. The foundation now included a mentorship program that paired experienced farmers with newcomers, ensuring that knowledge transfer happened continuously rather than only through inheritance documents. The 10th anniversary of my arrival in Millfield fell on a perfect October day, with golden sunlight streaming across fields ready for harvest, and the oak trees around the house displaying their full autumn glory. The decade had transformed not just my own life, but the entire community in ways that seemed almost miraculous compared to the struggling rural town I'd first encountered. The morning began with a celebration at Dorothy's Diner, where community members gathered to mark both my personal anniversary and the broader success of the revitalization efforts we'd all supported. The walls were covered with photographs documenting the changes: new businesses on Main Street, young families who'd moved to the area, successful foundation scholarship recipients, and community improvement projects that had enhanced quality of life for everyone. Dorothy herself, now in her 70s but still running the diner with characteristic efficiency, presented me with a scrapbook containing newspaper clippings, letters from grateful scholarship recipients, and testimonials from other communities that had adapted Millfield's development model. 10 years ago, she said as the gathered crowd applauded, we were all wondering if this town had a future. Now we're helping other places figure out how to build one. That's what happens when the right person shows up at the right time with the right attitude. The formal celebration that evening drew visitors from across the state, including government officials, academic researchers, and representatives from other rural communities. The keynote speaker was the state's Secretary of Agriculture, who praised Millfield as a model for sustainable rural development that balanced economic growth with environmental protection and community values. But the moment that meant the most to me came when Barbara Harris, now approaching 80 but still sharp and opinionated, stood up during the community recognition ceremony. Sarah Cook came to us as a lost teenager with nothing but a legal document and a willingness to work, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the packed high school gymnasium. She's leaving us. Well, she's not leaving us, but she's become something none of us could have predicted. She's become the person Raymond Cox always hoped she could be. And more importantly, she's become the person this community needed her to be. The standing ovation that followed brought tears to my eyes, not just for the recognition, but for the understanding that I truly belonged here in a way I'd never belonged anywhere else. Later that night, after the visitors had gone home and the cleanup was finished, I walked alone through the fields that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. The moon was full, casting silver light across the stubble of harvested corn and the green growth of winter wheat. In the distance, I could see the lights of neighboring farms, each one representing the family, a livelihood, a story of persistence and adaptation. Standing in the middle of the back pasture where I'd often come to think during difficult times, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The angry, defensive teenager who'd arrived with everything she owned in cardboard boxes had become a confident woman with deep roots in a thriving community. The farm that had once seemed impossibly challenging was now a successful, sustainable operation that provided both a comfortable living and resources for community investment. But more than the external changes, I marveled at the internal transformation. The girl who'd spent 17 years believing she had no family now had an extended family that included hundreds of people across multiple states. The young woman who'd never had a clear sense of purpose now woke up every morning knowing exactly why her work mattered and how it connected to something larger than herself. The foundation Raymond had established was now operating in 7 states, had funded more than 50 college scholarships, provided low-interest loans to 37 beginning farmers, and supported community development projects in dozens of rural towns. The model we developed in Millfield was being adapted and refined by communities facing similar challenges across the country. My own role had evolved from local farmer to regional advocate to national speaker on rural development issues. I served on advisory committees for 2 federal agencies, wrote regularly for agricultural publications, and consulted with communities and organizations working on rural revitalization. The work took me away from the farm more than I'd originally planned, but it also amplified the impact of what we'd accomplished in Millfield. The farm itself continued to evolve and improve. The organic vegetable operation now supplied restaurants in 3 cities. The Heritage Livestock Program was helping preserve rare breeds while producing premium meat and wool products. The agritourism activities brought thousands of visitors annually, providing revenue for the farm while educating urban consumers about agricultural life. But perhaps most importantly, the farm had become a training ground for the next generation of sustainable agriculture practitioners. Through internship programs, workshops, and mentorship opportunities, young people from across the region came to learn both the practical skills and philosophical approaches that made small-scale farming economically viable and environmentally responsible. As I entered my 2nd decade on the farm, I began thinking seriously about legacy and succession in ways that Raymond Cox would have understood. At 27, I was still young, but the responsibilities I'd taken on required long-term planning and careful preparation for whatever the future might bring. The Foundation Board and I had begun discussions about expanding our model internationally, working with organizations in developing countries where rural communities face similar challenges of economic sustainability and youth migration to cities. The core principles we developed, adapted for different cultural and economic contexts, seemed to have universal application. These conversations led to my first international consulting assignment, a 6-month project working with farming communities in rural Ireland that were struggling with many of the same issues Millfield had faced when I arrived. The experience was both challenging and rewarding, demonstrating that the lessons we'd learned had relevance far beyond our small corner of Oregon. Returning home from that assignment, I saw Millfield with fresh eyes and renewed appreciation for what we'd accomplished. The town that had once seemed to be slowly dying was now vibrant and growing, with new businesses, young families, and a sense of optimism about the future that attracted visitors and potential residents from around the country. The farm itself had become something I'd never imagined when I first inherited it. Not just a successful agricultural operation, but a demonstration site for sustainable practices, a training center for beginning farmers, and a model for how small-scale agriculture could be both economically viable and environmentally responsible. But the most meaningful aspect of my life remained the relationships I'd built within the community. Barbara Harris, now in her 80s, still stopped by regularly to offer advice and commentary on everything from crop rotation to local politics. Diane Carter had become not just my closest friend, but my business partner in several ventures that combined her veterinary expertise with my agricultural knowledge. Justin Green, approaching 80 himself, had become something like a grandfather figure, the wise elder who'd seen decades of change and could put current challenges in historical perspective. His gas station had become an informal community center where farmers gathered to discuss everything from weather patterns to equipment purchases to local gossip. Dorothy's Diner remained the town's social hub, where morning coffee brought together farmers, business owners, retirees, and newcomers in conversations that ranged from purely practical to deeply philosophical. Dorothy herself, now officially retired but still present most days, had become the community's unofficial historian and memory keeper. These relationships, built over years of shared work and common purpose, represented the kind of social capital that made rural communities resilient and sustainable. They were also the foundation for the mentorship and knowledge transfer that ensured continuity across generations. As I approached my 13th year on the farm, I began formalizing plans for my own succession. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I'd learned from Raymond's example that preparation was essential. The foundation now included provisions for leadership development and transition planning. The farm's business structure had been reorganized to facilitate eventual transfer to the next generation of managers. More importantly, I'd begun identifying and mentoring young people who showed both the passion and the practical skills necessary for agricultural leadership. Several foundation scholarship recipients had returned to the area after college, starting their own farming operations or taking leadership roles in agricultural businesses and community organizations. The cycle was completing itself in exactly the way Raymond had envisioned it when he'd first established the foundation. Young people were choosing to stay in or return to rural communities because they saw opportunities for meaningful work and sustainable livelihoods. The brain drain that had threatened small towns for decades was beginning to reverse itself. This transformation hadn't happened overnight or without significant challenges. There had been droughts and floods, economic downturns and political conflicts, personal setbacks and community disagreements. But the foundation of community investment, mutual support, and long-term thinking had proven strong enough to weather these difficulties and emerge stronger. Standing on my front porch on a warm summer evening, watching the sun set over fields that represented not just my livelihood, but my identity, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something lasting and meaningful. The angry, defensive teenager who'd arrived with everything she owned in cardboard boxes had become a confident woman with deep roots in a thriving community. But more than that, I'd become part of something larger than myself, a network of relationships and commitments that extended far beyond the boundaries of my own property. The farm was mine, but it was also part of a community, a region, a movement toward more sustainable and equitable approaches to rural development. The letters I continued to write to future generations had evolved into a comprehensive guide to community-based rural development, documenting not just the practical strategies that had worked in Millfield, but the philosophical approaches and relationship-building techniques that made those strategies effective. Today, 15 years after that first phone call from Ronald Miller's law office, I sit in the same kitchen where I first read Raymond Cox's letter, but everything else has changed in ways I could never have imagined. The scared 17-year-old who inherited a farm she didn't know how to run has become a 32-year-old woman whose work influences rural development policy at the national level. The foundation Raymond established has grown into a multi-million-dollar organization operating in 12 states and 3 countries. We've funded more than 200 college scholarships, provided startup capital for over 100 beginning farmers, and supported community development projects in dozens of rural towns. The model we developed in Millfield has been adapted and refined by communities facing similar challenges across the globe. My own farm has evolved into something that would make Raymond proud, a thriving, sustainable operation that demonstrates how small-scale agriculture can be both economically viable and environmentally responsible. But more than that, it's become a symbol of what's possible when communities invest in their young people and their own futures. The house itself reflects this journey of growth and belonging. The walls are lined with photographs documenting community celebrations, foundation events, and the dozens of young people who've passed through internship and mentorship programs. The kitchen table where I first read Raymond's letter now hosts weekly strategy sessions with community leaders, foundation board meetings, and informal gatherings of farmers sharing knowledge and solving problems together. But the most meaningful change is internal. The girl who spent 17 years believing she had no family now has relationships that span generations and continents. The young woman who never had a clear sense of purpose now wakes up every morning knowing exactly how her work contributes to something larger than herself. This transformation wasn't just personal, it was communal. Millfield has become a destination for people interested in sustainable rural development, attracting visitors, researchers, and potential residents from around the world. The town that once seemed to be slowly dying is now growing and thriving, with new businesses, young families, and a sense of optimism about the future. The secret wasn't complicated. It was about believing in people's potential, investing in community infrastructure, and creating opportunities for meaningful work and sustainable livelihoods. It was about understanding that rural communities don't need to choose between economic development and environmental protection, between preserving tradition and embracing innovation. As I write this, sitting at Raymond's old desk with the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, I'm preparing for my next international consulting assignment, this time working with farming communities in rural Kenya that are facing challenges similar to what we encountered here 15 years ago. The work takes me away from home more than I'd originally planned, but it also amplifies the impact of what we've accomplished. The farm will be in good hands during my absence. Three of our former interns, now experienced farmers in their own right, have formed a partnership that manages the day-to-day operations while I focus on foundation work and consulting. It's exactly the kind of succession planning that ensures continuity and growth across generations. Looking back on this journey, I'm struck by how much it all began with one person's decision to take a chance on someone he'd never met. Raymond Cox could have left his property to relatives who knew him, to neighbors who'd been part of his life for decades, or to organizations with established track records in agricultural management. Instead, he chose to invest in potential rather than proven performance, in hope rather than certainty. He believed that someone who understood what it meant to fight for a place to belong would be the right person to preserve and continue his life's work. That leap of faith changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of other people who've benefited from the foundation, the community development projects, and the model of rural revitalization we've created together. It demonstrates what's possible when we choose to see potential in unlikely places and invest in the future we want to create. To everyone who's listening to this story, I want you to know that you have the power to make similar choices in your own communities and relationships. Whether you're thinking about supporting a young person who needs a chance, investing in a community project that seems impossible, or simply believing in someone's potential when others see only problems, your decision to take that leap of faith could be the beginning of transformation you can't even imagine. The girl who thought she was alone at the orphanage discovered that she was never really alone at all. She was part of a community that extended across time and space, connected by shared values and common purpose. She just needed someone to help her find her place within it. If you're watching this from your own place of belonging, whether that's a small town like Millfield or a big city apartment, take a moment to appreciate the relationships and opportunities that brought you there. And if you're still looking for that place, still fighting for somewhere to belong, know that your journey has meaning and your destination is waiting. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story means to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that belonging is possible, that communities can change, that one person's decision to invest in another person's potential can create ripples that last for generations. Because that's what Raymond Cox taught me, and what I hope I passed on to you. We're all connected, we all have something to contribute, and we all deserve a place where we can grow into who we're meant to become. The farm is still here, the community is still thriving, and the work continues. That's the best legacy any of us can hope to leave behind.